Grandpa, why would you lock this barn with 3 heavy chains? Everyone says this land is worthless, but someone was desperate to keep this place sealed.
When a struggling waitress inherited 40 acres of overgrown mountain dirt, everyone told her to sell it for scrap. But hidden beneath decades of rot and rusted chains in her grandfather's collapsing barn lay a secret so rare it would trigger a ruthless legal war and change her life forever. Josephine Caldwell was 28 years old, exhausted, and barely scraping by on the meager tips she earned working double shifts at a roadside diner in Roanoke, Virginia. Her life had been a continuous loop of pouring lukewarm coffee and dodging past-due utility bills. She had long ago abandoned any childhood fantasies of sudden windfalls or fairy tale rescues. So, when a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at her cramped apartment, bearing the gold-embossed letterhead of Abernathy and Reed, a prestigious Richmond law firm, her first instinct was that she was being sued. Instead, the letter inside summoned her to the office of Thomas Abernathy, an estate attorney who smelled of expensive scotch and cedarwood. Sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, Josie felt entirely out of place in her scuffed sneakers and faded denim jacket. Abernathy, a man with calculating gray eyes and a perfectly tailored suit, slid a manila folder across the heavy desk. He informed her that her maternal grandfather, Arthur Pendelton, had passed away at the age of 89. Josie barely remembered Arthur. To her, he was just a phantom of the Appalachian Mountains, a fiercely paranoid recluse who had cut ties with her mother 3 decades ago. The family lore painted him as a brilliant but deeply troubled man who had once repaired foreign engines for wealthy socialites on the East Coast before abruptly retreating into the isolation of the Blue Ridge Mountains, never to be heard from again. "He left you everything, Miss Caldwell," Abernathy said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, the entirety of his estate. Specifically, a 43-acre parcel of land in the shadow of Mount Rogers. For a fleeting second, a spark of hope ignited in Josie's chest. Land meant money. Money meant freedom from the diner, freedom from the eviction notices taped to her apartment door. But Abernathy quickly extinguished that hope with a heavy sigh, opening the folder to reveal a stack of red-stamped documents. "Don't start planning your retirement just yet," the lawyer warned, tapping a manicured finger against the paperwork. "Your grandfather was not a wealthy man, nor was he a responsible one. The property is completely dilapidated. The cabin is practically crumbling into the earth. Worse, he hasn't paid property taxes in 14 years. There is a county tax lien on the estate, totaling $42,000. If that sum isn't paid by the end of the month, the county will seize the land and auction it off." Josie felt the air leave her lungs. $42,000 might as well have been $40 million. She didn't even have $400 in her checking account. The inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a crushing liability. "However," Abernathy continued, sliding a separate sheet of paper toward her, "there is a silver lining. A local real estate developer named Bradley Jenkins, who owns Summit Ridge Developments, has been trying to buy up that side of the mountain for years. He's planning a luxury eco-resort. He caught wind of Arthur's passing and submitted a cash offer this morning, $45,000. It's a lowball figure for 43 acres, but it clears the tax debt and leaves you with a clean $3,000 in your pocket. I strongly advise you to sign it." $3,000. It was enough to fix her car and pay a month of rent. It was the logical, safe choice. But as Josie looked at the harsh, impersonal legal documents, a strange stubbornness took root in her gut. She had never owned anything in her life. The thought of signing away her family's blood and history to some faceless developer without even laying eyes on the place felt like a betrayal. "I need to see it first," Josie said, her voice trembling slightly but carrying a defiant edge. Abernathy frowned, clearly annoyed by the delay. "Miss Caldwell, the county auction is in exactly 12 days. If Jenkins pulls his offer, you walk away with absolutely nothing. Don't let sentimentality bankrupt you." "I'll give you my answer by Monday," Josie replied, standing up and taking the keys to the property from the desk. The drive up into the Blue Ridge Mountains took 4 grueling hours. The paved highways eventually gave way to cracked asphalt, which then degraded into a treacherous, winding dirt road, completely swallowed by a canopy of ancient oaks and creeping kudzu. When Josie finally pulled her sputtering sedan up to the property line, her heart sank. Abernathy hadn't exaggerated. The estate was a graveyard of neglect. The main cabin was a sagging, weather-beaten structure with a caved-in porch and windows clouded by decades of grime. The yard was a jungle of thorn bushes, rusted scrap metal, and discarded tires. It looked exactly like the worthless nightmare the lawyer had described. But as Josie stepped out of her car, the crisp mountain air biting at her cheeks, her eyes were drawn to a massive structure, sitting about 200 yards behind the cabin, partially obscured by a grove of dying pine trees. It was a barn, but it wasn't a standard rickety wooden shed. This barn was built like a fortress. It had reinforced steel siding, a heavy corrugated roof, and massive double doors that were wrapped in thick, industrial-grade steel chains and secured with 3 heavy-duty brass padlocks. Before she could walk toward it, the crunch of gravel echoed down the driveway. A sleek, brand-new black SUV rolled onto the property, completely out of place against the backdrop of poverty and decay. A man stepped out. He wore a designer overcoat and a condescending smile. "You must be Josephine," the man said, approaching her with the unearned confidence of someone used to getting exactly what he wanted. "I'm Bradley Jenkins. I figured you'd come up here to see the ruins for yourself." Josie crossed her arms, instantly disliking the developer. "You're the one trying to buy my land." "I'm the one trying to save you from a catastrophic financial mistake," Jenkins corrected smoothly, his eyes sweeping over the dilapidated property with utter disgust. "Look around, kid. This place is a toxic dump. It's going to cost me a fortune just to clear the debris. Take the 45 grand. Go back to the city. If you don't sign my offer by tomorrow, I'm pulling it. And then the county takes it all, and you get nothing." Jenkins was pushing too hard. He was too eager, too desperate to close the deal on a supposedly worthless patch of dirt. Josie narrowed her eyes, looking past him to the heavily chained fortress-like barn in the distance. "I'm not signing anything yet, Mr. Jenkins," Josie said coldly. "Now get off my property." Jenkins's smile vanished. His eyes darkened with a sudden, predatory malice. "You're playing a dangerous game, little girl. You have no idea what you're dealing with." He got back into his SUV and sped off, leaving Josie alone in the eerie silence of the mountain. That night, a violent Appalachian thunderstorm rolled over the mountain, turning the dirt road into a river of thick, impassable mud. Josie had no choice but to take shelter inside her grandfather's rotting cabin. The interior smelled of mildew, stale tobacco, and absolute isolation. She navigated the dark rooms with the beam of her smartphone flashlight, stepping over stacks of yellowed newspapers and empty tin cans. Despite the chaos, there was one area that was meticulously organized. A heavy oak desk tucked into the corner of the living room. Josie sat down and opened the top drawer, wiping away a thick layer of dust. Inside, she found a stack of handwritten ledgers. They weren't filled with the chaotic ramblings of a madman, as her family had claimed. They were incredibly precise mechanical logs. She turned the brittle pages, reading entries dating back to the late 1960s. Arthur had documented engine rebuilds, suspension calibrations, and custom part fabrications. But what caught Josie's eye were the names jotted in the margins. They weren't local mountain folk. She recognized the name Luigi Cinetti. A quick internet search on her phone, struggling for a single bar of signal, revealed him to be a legendary Italian race car driver and the primary importer of Ferraris to the United States. The last entry in the ledger was dated just 3 weeks before Arthur's death. It was written in a shaky, frantic hand. "Jenkins knows. He's trying to starve me out. The taxes are a trap. I have secured the Marinello ghost in the vault. They cannot have her." Josie's breath hitched. The Marinello ghost. The vault. She immediately looked out the grimy window toward the backyard. Lightning flashed, illuminating the massive chain-wrapped barn in the distance. The vault. Driven by a sudden, overpowering surge of adrenaline, Josie grabbed a heavy iron crowbar she had seen resting by the fireplace. She threw on her grandfather's moldy canvas coat to block the freezing rain and kicked open the front door. The storm was brutal, rain lashing against her face as she sprinted through the knee-high, soaked weeds toward the barn. Up close, the structure was even more intimidating. The heavy steel chains wrapping the double doors were rusted, but incredibly thick. The 3 brass padlocks looked seemingly impenetrable. Josie wiped the rain from her eyes, gripping the crowbar tightly. She wedged the iron bar into the first padlock shackle, using the full weight of her body to lever it against the heavy steel door. For 10 minutes, she fought the metal, her hands blistering and bleeding, until finally, with a sharp crack, the rusted hasp of the first lock shattered. Fueled by desperation, she moved to the second and third, smashing them with the heavy iron end of the crowbar until the mechanisms failed. With a heavy metallic groan, the heavy chains slid off the handles and crashed into the mud. Josie grabbed the iron handles and pulled. The massive doors shrieked in protest, scraping against the concrete floor as she forced them open just wide enough to slip inside. She stepped into the pitch-black interior, shivering from the cold, and raised her flashlight. The air inside the barn was dry and still, smelling intensely of old motor oil, dry rotted rubber, and dust. The space was massive, but it was entirely empty, save for one colossal object sitting dead center in the room. It was covered in a massive, heavy, dust-caked canvas tarp, staked to the ground with heavy concrete blocks. Josie walked toward it slowly, the silence of the barn contrasting sharply with the roaring thunder outside. Her hands were shaking as she reached out, gripping the thick fabric of the tarp. She pulled it back. A cloud of dust plumed into the air, dancing in the beam of her flashlight. As the particles settled, the beam reflected off something brilliantly, impossibly red. Josie gasped, stumbling back a step. Sitting before her, resting on flat tires but otherwise looking completely untouched by the ravages of time, was a vintage automobile. It was low to the ground, with sweeping, sensual curves, iconic covered headlights, and wire-spoke wheels that glinted faintly in the light. Even covered in a layer of fine dust, the craftsmanship was breathtaking. Josie moved closer, wiping a gloved hand across the hood. There, gleaming in the center of the grille, was a rectangular yellow badge featuring a black, prancing horse. Josie didn't know anything about classic cars, but even she knew what a Ferrari was. She wiped the dust from the windshield, leaning in to look at the pristine leather interior, the wooden steering wheel, and the gated manual shifter. It was beautiful. It was a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT SWB, California Spider. She didn't know the exact model name yet, nor did she know that it was one of only about 50 ever built. She certainly didn't know that collectors routinely paid upwards of $18 million for them at auction. All she knew was that Bradley Jenkins wasn't trying to buy 43 acres of dirt. He was trying to steal a masterpiece. Suddenly, the harsh glare of high-beam headlights flooded the barn, casting long, terrifying shadows across the walls. Josie spun around. A vehicle had driven right up to the barn doors. Two silhouettes stepped out of the blinding light and walked into the barn. One was Bradley Jenkins. The other was wearing a tan uniform, Deputy Carl Higgins of the County Sheriff's Department. "I warned you, Josephine," Jenkins said, his voice echoing coldly in the cavernous space. His eyes locked onto the partially uncovered red hood of the Ferrari, a greedy, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "I told you not to play games." Deputy Higgins stepped forward, resting his hand casually on the grip of his holstered firearm. "Miss Caldwell, you are trespassing. I have a court order signed by the county judge this evening. Due to an unpaid promissory note forged against this estate, this property and all of its contents have been legally seized by Summit Ridge Developments." Josie's heart slammed against her ribs. They had bribed a judge. They were fast-tracking a fake foreclosure in the middle of the night to steal the car before she even knew what it was. She was alone on a dark mountain with two corrupt men who had millions of dollars on the line. "You can't do this," Josie said, backing up against the driver's side door of the Ferrari. "This is my grandfather's property." "Not anymore, kid," Jenkins sneered, pulling a set of heavy zip ties from his coat pocket. "Now, are you going to walk off this mountain quietly, or is Deputy Higgins going to have to arrest you for resisting eviction?" Josie pressed her spine against the freezing metal of the Ferrari's driver's side door, her mind racing faster than her heart. She was entirely outmatched. Deputy Higgins stood with his hand resting menacingly on his holstered weapon, while Bradley Jenkins exuded the arrogant confidence of a man who owned the county. The heavy rain continued to hammer against the corrugated steel roof of the barn, a deafening drumbeat that masked the sound of Josie sliding her trembling hand into her coat pocket. Her fingers found her smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with Jenkins, she blindly double-tapped the side button to activate the voice memo shortcut she used at the diner to remember large orders. A faint, single vibration confirmed it was recording. "A fake promissory note," Josie said, pitching her voice loud enough to be clearly picked up over the storm. "You forged a debt against my grandfather to steal his property?" Jenkins let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Let's call it a creative reassignment of assets, Josephine. Your grandfather was a hoarder who squandered a masterpiece. Judge Carter signed the seizure order an hour ago. It's perfectly legal. Or, at least, legal enough that a broke diner waitress will never be able to afford the lawyers required to prove otherwise. And you, a sworn deputy, are just going to help him steal a multi-million-dollar car?" Josie directed her gaze at Higgins, keeping the men talking. Higgins spat a wad of chewing tobacco onto the concrete floor. "Mr. Jenkins pays for the new cruisers at the precinct, little lady. Now, I suggest you take a long walk down the mountain before I decide you're trespassing and resisting arrest." Josie gripped the heavy iron crowbar she had used to break the padlocks, hiding it slightly behind her leg. She knew they wouldn't shoot her over a car, not if they wanted a clean getaway, but they would absolutely restrain her, lock her in the back of a squad car, and ruin her life with bogus charges while Jenkins made off with the Ferrari. She needed a distraction. Her eyes darted to the ceiling. Hanging directly above Jenkins and Higgins was a massive, rusted cast-iron engine hoist, suspended by a thick chain hooked to a heavy wooden crossbeam. The chain was secured to a steel cleat bolted to the wall just 3 feet to Josie's left. "I'm not leaving without my grandfather's property," Josie said, taking a deliberate step to the left. "Have it your way," Jenkins sighed, nodding to the deputy. "Cuff her." As Higgins stepped forward, reaching for his belt, Josie swung the crowbar with every ounce of adrenaline flooding her system. She didn't aim for the men. She smashed the heavy iron bar directly into the rusted locking mechanism of the steel cleat on the wall. The brittle metal shattered with a sharp crack. The chain released instantly. The 2-ton cast-iron engine hoist plummeted from the ceiling, crashing into the concrete floor directly between Jenkins and Higgins with the force of an exploding bomb. The impact sent a shockwave of concrete shrapnel and rusted metal flying. Higgins shouted in panic, diving backward into the mud outside, while Jenkins covered his face, stumbling into the side of his SUV. Josie didn't hesitate. She dropped the crowbar and sprinted toward the rear of the barn. Plunging into the pitch-black shadows, she found a small, rotting wooden side door she had noticed from the outside. She threw her shoulder against it. The rotted wood gave way, splintering outward, and Josie tumbled into the freezing, torrential downpour. "Get her!" Jenkins screamed from inside the barn, his voice cracking with rage. Josie scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't head for her sedan. She knew they would block the driveway. Instead, she plunged directly into the treacherous, heavily wooded slope of the Appalachian mountainside. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. Briars tore at her jeans, and low-hanging branches whipped across her face, drawing blood. She slipped on wet shale, sliding down muddy embankments, completely blinded by the rain. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of Higgins shouting, followed by the terrifying crack of a warning shot echoing through the trees. But they were city men wearing heavy coats and expensive boots. They had no chance of tracking a desperate woman through a flooded mountain forest at midnight. Josie hiked for 3 agonizing hours. Her muscles burned, and her hands were numb with cold. Finally, she broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the gravel shoulder of State Route 58. A mile down the road, the neon sign of an all-night truck stop buzzed in the gloom. Dripping wet, covered in mud and blood, Josie pushed through the glass doors of the diner. The overnight waitress stared at her in shock. Josie ignored the stares, walking straight to a booth in the back. She pulled her waterlogged phone from her pocket. The screen was cracked, but as she pressed the power button, the Apple logo faintly illuminated. The recording had saved. She needed help. She couldn't go to the local police. Higgins was proof that the county sheriff's department was compromised. She needed someone who understood the magnitude of what was in that barn. Pulling out her grandfather's ledger, which she had stuffed inside her coat before fleeing, she flipped to the back pages. There, written in neat handwriting, was a list of emergency contacts. One name had 3 stars next to it. Elias Crawford, Virginia State Bureau of Investigation, retired. Josie asked the diner waitress to borrow the landline and dialed the number. When a gruff, sleep-heavy voice answered, Josie didn't bother introducing herself. "My name is Josephine Caldwell," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Arthur Pendelton was my grandfather, and Bradley Jenkins is trying to steal the Marinello ghost." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" Elias Crawford finally asked, his voice suddenly sharp and wide awake. "Do not speak to local law enforcement. I am on my way." Elias Crawford arrived at the truck stop just as the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s, with a silver beard and piercing blue eyes that immediately took stock of Josie's battered condition. He brought her a dry jacket and ordered 2 black coffees before sitting across from her in the booth. Josie played the audio recording. Elias listened intently to Jenkins confessing to the forged promissory note and to the corrupt judge who signed it. When the recording finished, Elias let out a slow, heavy breath. "Arthur and I were friends 40 years ago," Elias explained, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "I investigated a stolen vehicle ring operating out of the ports in Baltimore. Your grandfather was an independent consultant for the insurance companies. He had a photographic memory for engine components. He was a genius, but he was paranoid. He bought that mountain land to get away from the people who realized he couldn't be bought." Jenkins called the car a masterpiece, Josie said, shivering slightly despite the dry jacket. "What is it?" "If your grandfather really had a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT SWB California Spider," Elias said softly, It is the holy grail of classic motoring. Only 56 were ever made. It's an aluminum-bodied race car wearing a tailored Italian suit. It's worth, conservatively, $20 million. But there's a catch. Jenkins can't just sell it on Craigslist. The classic car market is a small, fiercely guarded ecosystem. To sell a car of that magnitude, Jenkins needs a broker, provenance papers, and most importantly, he needs to get it out of the state immediately. Elias immediately made phone calls to his former colleagues at the state capitol in Richmond. Because the local county judge and sheriff's department were implicated in the recording, the state police bypassed local jurisdiction entirely. By noon, a convoy of unmarked state trooper vehicles was tearing up the dirt road toward Arthur's property. Josie rode in the passenger seat of Elias's truck, trailing the police. When they arrived at the property, the scene was exactly as she had feared. The massive barn doors were wide open. The thick chains and shattered padlocks lay in the mud, and the center of the room was completely empty. The Ferrari was gone. State troopers swarmed the property, taking photos and dusting for prints. But Jenkins had been thorough. There was no sign of the vehicle, and when state investigators raided Summit Ridge Development's corporate office an hour later, Jenkins sat at his desk with a smug, untouchable smile. He produced the judge's signed foreclosure order, claiming he had simply seized abandoned scrap metal to satisfy a debt, and that the scrap had already been crushed and recycled. Without physical evidence of the car, the audio recording was just a conversation about a supposed asset. Jenkins was stonewalling them. Defeated, Josie sat on the decaying porch of her grandfather's cabin as the sun began to set on the mountain. She had the proof of corruption, but without the Ferrari, Jenkins would likely post bail, hire an army of lawyers, and escape any real justice. She opened her grandfather's ledger again, staring at his final entry. "I have secured the Marinello ghost in the vault. They cannot have her." Elias walked up the porch steps, handing Josie a bottle of water. Jenkins used an enclosed semi-truck. "We found tire tracks down near the highway. He's likely moved it to a private, climate-controlled storage facility across state lines, maybe North Carolina or Georgia. He'll wait for the heat to die down before trying to find an overseas buyer." Josie frowned, her eyes locked on the ledger. "Elias, you said my grandfather was a genius with engines." "The best I ever saw," Elias nodded. When Jenkins unveiled the car, Josie recalled, her brow furrowing in deep concentration, it was resting on flat tires. But something was wrong. The front of the car. It was sitting entirely too high. The gap between the front tires and the wheel wells was massive. "I didn't think anything of it at the time, but if there was a giant V12 engine under that hood, shouldn't the front suspension have been weighed down?" Elias froze. He stared at Josie, his blue eyes widening in sudden realization. He snatched the ledger from her hands, flipping rapidly through the pages of mechanical notes. "Matching numbers," Elias whispered. "What?" "In the vintage Ferrari world, the value of the car is entirely dependent on matching numbers," Elias explained rapidly, his excitement building. "The chassis frame, the gearbox, and the engine block all leave the factory in Italy stamped with the exact same serial number. If a collector finds out the engine has been swapped out for a different one, the value of the car plummets by more than half. It becomes a replica, a shell." Elias looked around the decaying cabin, his eyes darting to the heavy oak desk in the corner. Arthur knew Jenkins was coming. He knew the county would try to seize the property. He wouldn't just leave a $20 million car sitting intact in a barn. Josie stood up, her heart pounding. He pulled the engine. "He gutted it," Elias laughed, a sound of pure triumph. "Jenkins didn't steal a $20 million Ferrari. He stole an empty metal shell. The real treasure, the matching numbers Colombo 512 engine, is still here somewhere." Josie and Elias tore into the cabin. They tore up the moldy carpets and pushed aside the stacks of newspapers. It didn't take long for Elias to notice deep, heavy scratch marks on the hardwood floor near the fireplace, leading directly toward the heavy oak desk. Together, they shoved the massive desk aside. Beneath it, the floorboards were distinctly different. They were newer, held down by heavy industrial torque screws rather than standard nails. Elias ran out to his truck and returned with a heavy-duty drill. He backed out the screws one by one, tossing them aside. With a pry bar, he lifted the heavy oak floorboards. Beneath the cabin was a reinforced, concrete-lined root cellar that had been entirely retrofitted into a hermetically sealed vault. Josie leaned over the edge, shining her flashlight into the darkness. Resting in the center of the underground room, bolted to an engine stand and wrapped in protective thermal plastic, was a massive, pristine 12-cylinder engine. Even covered in plastic, the sheer mechanical beauty of it was undeniable. Sticking to the top of the plastic wrap was a small white envelope with Josie's name written on it. She climbed down the wooden ladder into the vault, her hands shaking as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, containing a short handwritten note and a small brass key. Josie, if you are reading this, the vultures came, and you were brave enough to fight them off. The body of the ghost is just metal. This engine is her heart. Enclosed is the key to a safety deposit box in Roanoke containing the original Italian title and provenance papers. Let Jenkins try to sell an empty shell. You hold the soul of the machine. Love, Grandpa Art. The morning after discovering the hidden vault, Josie Caldwell and Elias Crawford stood inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit vault of a downtown Roanoke bank. The small brass key slid perfectly into box number 814. With a heavy click, the metal door swung open, revealing a stack of immaculate, preserved paperwork. At the very top lay the original, notarized Italian title of the 1961 Ferrari 250 GT SWB California Spider, alongside the original bill of sale, signed by the legendary Luigi Cinetti. More importantly, there was a detailed, meticulously kept logbook proving unbroken ownership by Arthur Pendelton since 1971. In the hyper-regulated, provenance-obsessed world of classic car collecting, this stack of paper was worth its weight in gold. Without it, the physical car was a ghost uninsurable, unsellable, and inherently suspicious. Jenkins had stolen a museum piece, but Josie held its birth certificate. 300 miles away, inside a clandestine, climate-controlled storage facility on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, Bradley Jenkins was about to discover exactly how badly he had been outplayed. Jenkins had spent the last 48 hours frantically working his back-channel connections to find a private buyer. He finally secured a viewing with Charles Montgomery, a notoriously strict but incredibly wealthy British broker who specialized in European exotics. Montgomery arrived at the warehouse, flanked by two silent security guards, his eyes critical as Jenkins confidently pulled back the heavy canvas tarp. The paint is original, Jenkins boasted, running a hand over the sweeping red fender. As you can see, Mr. Montgomery, she is absolutely pristine, a true barn find. I'm willing to let it go for $15 million, provided the funds are transferred to my offshore holding account today. Montgomery didn't look at Jenkins. He knelt, examining the wire-spoke wheels, the leather interior, and the iconic grille. The chassis appears authentic. But an offshore transfer without provenance papers? That is highly irregular. Before I even consider calling my bank, I need to verify the matching numbers. Open the hood. Jenkins smiled, an arrogant smirk that masked his absolute lack of mechanical knowledge. He reached into the cabin, pulled the hood release lever, and walked around to lift the beautifully sculpted aluminum panel. Behold, Mr. Montgomery. The heart of the... Jenkins froze. The words died in his throat. Montgomery adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, leaning over the fender to stare into a massive, echoing void. There was no gleaming manifold. There were no carburetors. There was no engine whatsoever. Just an empty bay of grease-stained metal and severed rubber hoses. Is this a joke? Montgomery snapped, his British accent clipping with immediate fury. You bring me to a warehouse in the middle of nowhere to sell me an empty, undocumented shell? This isn't a Ferrari, Mr. Jenkins. This is stolen scrap. Wait, I didn't know, Jenkins stammered, panic finally piercing his arrogant facade. The old man, he must have taken it out. Before Jenkins could attempt to salvage the disastrous meeting, the heavy steel doors of the warehouse suddenly shrieked open. The blinding red and blue strobe lights of Georgia State Patrol cruisers flooded the facility. Elias Crawford strode into the warehouse, flanked by a dozen heavily armed state troopers. Bradley Jenkins! Elias's voice echoed off the concrete walls, commanding and absolute. You are under arrest for grand larceny, forgery, and interstate trafficking of stolen property. Jenkins backed away, his face pale as a sheet. I have a court order. That car was legally seized. We spoke to Judge Carter this morning, Elias countered, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. Turns out, when faced with federal wire fraud charges over a fake promissory note, he was more than happy to revoke your seizure order and testify against you. Oh, and Deputy Higgins sends his regards from a holding cell in Virginia. The arrest of Bradley Jenkins sent shockwaves through the local political landscape. The audio recording Josie had captured on her phone, combined with the undeniable evidence of the forged documents, dismantled Jenkins's corrupt empire overnight. Summit Ridge Developments was liquidated to pay off federal fines. With Jenkins behind bars, the empty shell of the Ferrari was securely transported back to Virginia under state police escort. In a meticulously clean garage in Richmond, under the supervision of top-tier mechanical experts, the heavy, plastic-wrapped Colombo 512 engine was finally hoisted from the back of Elias's truck. Josie watched with tears in her eyes as the mechanics gently lowered her grandfather's masterpiece back into the engine bay. The heavy steel bolts were torqued, the fuel lines were reconnected, and the fluids were topped off. When the master mechanic finally turned the key, the engine didn't just start, it roared. The deafening, aggressive, beautiful symphony of 12 cylinders echoed through the garage, bringing the Maranello ghost back to life after 50 years of silence. 6 months later, Josie Caldwell stood on the pristine green lawns of Pebble Beach, California. She was no longer wearing scuffed sneakers and a faded denim jacket. Dressed in an elegant designer suit, she watched as the 1961 Ferrari 250 GT SWB California Spider rolled onto the auction block at the world-renowned R.M. Sotheby's Classic Car event. The bidding was an absolute frenzy. The story of the stolen shell, the hidden vault, and the ultimate reunification of the matching numbers engine had turned the car into an international legend. The auctioneers